Hey everyone! Before we dive into this incredible story of kindness, redemption, and second chances, I've got a quick favor to ask. If you love heartwarming stories that inspire and make you think, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this. Alright, now sit back, relax, and get ready for an emotional journey through the fields of Willow Creek, where one farmer's unexpected act of generosity changes the lives of a struggling family forever. Let's get into the rich farmer's generosity. The moon hung low over the wide-open fields of Willow Creek, casting silver light on the rows of golden corn, swaying gently in the evening breeze. It was a peaceful night, the kind that made Jacob Turner feel grateful for the life he had built. Jacob was a wealthy farmer, one of the richest men in the county, known for his hard work and vast acres of farmland that stretched as far as the eye could see. But that night, as he made his usual rounds before heading home, something unusual caught his eye. There, in the farthest corner of his cornfield, figures moved in the darkness. Someone was stealing from his land. Jacob clenched his jaw, his heartbeat quickening. He wasn't an unkind man, but he worked hard for every ear of corn, every sack of grain. He had no patience for thieves. He turned off his lantern, moving silently through the field, his boots crunching against the dry soil. As he got closer, he saw them clearly. A woman, thin as a reed, holding a sack half filled with corn. Beside her, two small children clutched ears of corn tightly, their faces pale and tired. Jacob's anger melted into confusion. This wasn't a band of robbers. It was a mother and her children stealing food, not for greed, but for survival. The woman gasped as she saw him approach. She grabbed her children and tried to run, but Jacob's deep voice stopped her. "Wait!" The woman froze, her shoulders trembling. She slowly turned around, her eyes filled with fear. The children clung to her legs, their eyes wide with worry. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, we didn't mean no harm." Jacob crossed his arms, studying them under the moonlight. The woman's dress was old and torn, her hands rough and calloused. The children, a boy and a girl, looked no older than 6 or 7, their little bodies too thin for their age. "What's your name?" Jacob asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The woman hesitated. "Eliza. My name is Eliza Harper." She swallowed hard, glancing at her children before speaking again. "And these are my kids, Tommy and Sarah." Jacob looked at the sack in her hand. "You were stealing my corn." Eliza lowered her head. "Yes," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I had no choice. My husband, he died last winter. We lost our home, been living in an old shack by the river. The kids ain't eaten in 2 days." Her voice broke as she whispered, "I didn't know what else to do." A deep silence filled the space between them. Jacob felt something stir inside him, something heavier than anger, deeper than pity. "I should call the sheriff," he said slowly, watching her reaction. Eliza flinched, her grip on her children tightening. "But I won't," Jacob continued. He let out a long sigh and ran a hand through his graying hair. "I can't let you keep stealing from me, but I won't let you starve either." Eliza looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please, sir, I'll do anything. I can work. I can clean, cook. Just don't take my children away from me." Jacob exhaled, making his decision. "Come with me." Eliza hesitated, but the look in Jacob's eyes wasn't cruel. It wasn't the look of a man who would turn them in or hurt them. Slowly, she nodded, gathering her children close as they followed him across the field. Jacob led them toward his farmhouse, the warm glow of lantern light spilling from the windows. It was a large house, sturdy and welcoming, with a long wooden porch and a swinging bench. Jacob opened the door, stepping inside, and gestured for them to follow. As Eliza and the children hesitated at the threshold, the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat filled their noses. Sarah whimpered softly at the scent, her little hands clutching her empty belly. "Sit," Jacob said, pulling out a chair at the wooden dining table. Eliza's lips trembled as she obeyed, gathering her children beside her. Jacob moved toward the stove, scooping up generous portions of stew into bowls. He placed one in front of each of them, then handed them thick slices of warm bread. Tommy and Sarah wasted no time. They dug in with shaky hands, stuffing their mouths as if afraid the food might disappear. Eliza, however, held her bowl carefully, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't understand," she murmured, looking up at Jacob. "Why are you doing this?" Jacob leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Because I know what it's like to be hungry." His voice was quiet, almost lost in the crackling of the fireplace. "And because kindness is a man's greatest wealth." Eliza wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I'll work for you," she said firmly. "I don't want charity. Just a chance." Jacob nodded. "Tomorrow you'll start in the kitchen with my housekeeper, Mrs. Whitaker. I'll find something for the boy to do too, once he's a little stronger. And you," he said, looking at Sarah, "will go to school. No child should have to worry about food when they should be learning." Eliza let out a sob, covering her mouth. She nodded over and over again, unable to speak. For the first time in months, she felt something she had nearly forgotten: hope. Jacob Turner, the richest farmer in Willow Creek, had given them more than food. He had given them a second chance. And as the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Eliza and her children knew their lives were about to change forever. The sun had barely risen when Eliza stepped outside onto the porch of Jacob Turner's farmhouse. The crisp morning air smelled of damp earth and fresh hay, a scent that reminded her of home. Her old home, the one she and her husband had before the sickness took him and left her and the children with nothing. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked down at Tommy and Sarah, who were still sleeping on the cot that Jacob had set up for them in the housekeeper's quarters. For the first time in months, they had slept with full bellies, wrapped in clean blankets instead of shivering in the cold. Eliza closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. It still didn't feel real. She thought about the moment Jacob had caught them in the cornfield. She had expected him to punish them, maybe turn them over to the sheriff, but instead, he had shown them kindness. Kindness she hadn't seen from anyone in a long time. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper." Eliza turned to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway. Her gray hair was tied neatly in a bun, and she wore a long apron over her dress. The woman had kind eyes, but they were sharp, like they missed nothing. "You must be Mrs. Whitaker," Eliza said softly, straightening her posture. "That I am," Mrs. Whitaker replied, "and you'll be working under me in the kitchen. Mr. Turner may be generous, but he doesn't tolerate laziness. If you're to stay, you must earn your keep." Eliza nodded. "I understand." "Good. Then follow me." Mrs. Whitaker led her into the kitchen, a warm, inviting space filled with the rich scent of fresh bread and bacon sizzling in a pan. Copper pots hung from the walls, and a long wooden table sat in the center, already covered in flour and dough. Eliza's stomach tightened. It had been a long time since she had worked in a proper kitchen. "We start early on this farm," Mrs. Whitaker said, rolling up her sleeves. "The farm hands will be coming in for breakfast soon. You'll help prepare meals, wash dishes, and keep the kitchen clean. Can you cook?" "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said quickly. "I used to cook for my family before." She trailed off, not wanting to talk about what had happened. Mrs. Whitaker studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Then let's see what you can do." Eliza got to work, rolling out dough while Mrs. Whitaker fried eggs and bacon over the stove. The two women worked in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the crackling of the fire and the occasional clatter of pots and pans. After a few minutes, Mrs. Whitaker spoke again. "Mr. Turner didn't have to take you in, you know." Eliza swallowed hard. "I know. But he did. And that means he sees something in you. Don't make him regret it." Eliza set her jaw. "I won't." Mrs. Whitaker nodded approvingly. "Good. Now, finish that dough. We have a long day ahead." Outside, Tommy stood beside the big red barn, looking up at the tallest man he had ever seen. The man had broad shoulders, dark skin, and strong hands covered in dirt from working the land. He chewed on a piece of straw as he looked down at Tommy. "You ever work on a farm before, boy?" Tommy shook his head. "No, sir." The man chuckled. "Well, ain't no better time to learn." He extended a rough, calloused hand. "Name's Henry. I run the stables. Mr. Turner told me to find you something to do." Tommy hesitated before shaking Henry's hand. The man's grip was strong, but not unkind. "You ever been around horses?" Henry asked. Tommy's eyes widened. "Only once. My pa let me pet one at the fair when I was little." Henry grinned. "Well, you're about to get a lot closer to 'em than that." He led Tommy into the barn, where several horses stood in their stalls, their dark eyes watching curiously as the boy entered. The scent of hay and leather filled the air. Tommy felt nervous, but excited. "Your job is simple," Henry said. "You're going to help me feed 'em, clean out the stalls, and brush 'em down. Think you can handle that?" Tommy nodded eagerly. Henry handed him a wooden bucket filled with oats. "Start with Daisy over there. She's gentle." Tommy approached the horse slowly, his small hands shaking as he reached into the bucket and held out a handful of oats. Daisy sniffed his hand before nuzzling into the food, her soft nose brushing against his fingers. Tommy laughed, a real, joyful laugh, one he hadn't let out in a long time. Henry watched him with a nod. "You'll do just fine, boy." And for the first time since his father had died, Tommy felt useful. He felt needed. Sarah stood outside the small wooden schoolhouse at the edge of the farm, her tiny hands gripping the straps of the old satchel that Mrs. Whitaker had given her. She looked up at Jacob, who had personally walked her there. "Are you scared?" Jacob asked. Sarah bit her lip and nodded. Jacob crouched down to her level. "Listen to me, little one. You're smart. I can see it in your eyes. You belong here, just like every other child in that schoolhouse. You go in there and learn all you can, because one day you'll do great things." Sarah looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if they don't like me?" Jacob smiled. "Then you show them why they should." With that, he gave her a gentle nudge toward the door. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped inside. The room was filled with children of different ages, their heads turning to look at the newcomer. A woman stood at the front of the room, her spectacles resting low on her nose. "You must be Sarah Harper," the woman said kindly. "Welcome to our school. Take a seat, dear." Sarah hesitated before sitting in an empty chair near the back. A few of the children whispered to each other, but no one said anything mean. As the lesson began, Sarah listened carefully. She had always wanted to learn, but there had never been time. Now, sitting in that schoolhouse, she promised herself that she would make the most of this opportunity. She would make her mother proud. That evening, as the sun set over the fields of Willow Creek, Jacob sat on his porch, watching Eliza as she carried a basket of fresh bread to the barn. Tommy ran beside Henry, laughing as he chased a chicken that had gotten loose, and Sarah sat under a tree with a small book in her hands, her face lit with quiet excitement as she read. Jacob sighed, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He had taken in a family of strangers, people who had nothing, and given them a chance. And as he watched them that evening, he knew he had done the right thing. Because kindness, he reminded himself, was a man's greatest wealth, and he intended to be the richest man of all. The days on Jacob Turner's farm passed quickly, and the Harper family slowly began to find their place. The rich farmland that once seemed like a forbidden world was now their home, filled with the warmth of new friendships and the promise of a better life. But life was never without its hardships. One evening, as Eliza wiped her hands on her apron after a long day in the kitchen, Mrs. Whitaker gave her a knowing look. "You're learning fast," she said. Eliza smiled. "I used to cook every day for my family. It comes back quick when you've done it long enough." Mrs. Whitaker nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Have you thought about the future?" Eliza frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you plan to stay on this farm forever? Mr. Turner is a good man, but he doesn't take in strays without reason. He's giving you an opportunity, but at some point, you'll need to stand on your own 2 feet. Eliza swallowed hard. She had been so focused on surviving each day that she hadn't thought about the long term. "I just want to keep my children safe," she whispered. "I want them to have something better than I did." Mrs. Whitaker softened. "Then work hard. Save what you can. And when the time comes, be ready to take the next step." Eliza nodded, the weight of her words settling deep in her heart. While Eliza worked in the kitchen and Sarah studied at school, Tommy had taken to farm life with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. Each morning, he would wake before dawn, eager to follow Henry into the barn. He loved the feel of the soft hay beneath his fingers, the scent of leather saddles, and the quiet bond he had formed with the horses. But not everyone on the farm welcomed the new faces. One of the older farm hands, a man named Roy, watched Tommy with cold eyes. "We ain't runnin' no charity house," he muttered to Henry one afternoon as they leaned against the barn wall, watching the boy brush down a horse. Henry sighed, shaking his head. "He works harder than half the men here, Roy." Roy scoffed. "For now. But what happens when he gets tired? Or when the mother decides she don't like taking orders no more?" He spat on the ground. "Turner's too soft, bringing in strangers like that. It's trouble waiting to happen." Henry straightened. "You don't know their story." "I don't need to know their story," Roy said. "I just know that nothing good comes from charity." Henry clenched his jaw but said nothing. He had been around long enough to know that some men carried their bitterness, like a badge of honor. Later that evening, Tommy overheard the conversation as he cleaned out the horse stalls. His hands trembled, anger rising in his chest. He wanted to prove Roy wrong, to prove that he and his family belonged here. But how? A week later, Eliza made her first major mistake on the farm. It was a busy morning, and she had been tasked with helping prepare food for the farmhands. Mrs. Whitaker had gone to town for supplies, leaving Eliza in charge. She wanted to impress everyone, to show them she was capable. But in her rush, she miscalculated the amount of flour needed for the biscuits. By the time they were pulled from the oven, they were hard as bricks. The farmhands muttered in disappointment as they tried to eat, and Roy made no effort to hide his smirk. "Guess you ain't much of a cook after all," he said loudly, chuckling as he tossed a biscuit onto the table with a loud thud. Eliza's face burned with embarrassment. She gritted her teeth and said nothing, but inside she felt like she had failed. That evening, as she sat alone in the small quarters she shared with her children, Jacob knocked on the door. She opened it slowly. "Mr. Turner." He studied her face, then handed her a loaf of fresh bread. "Mrs. Whitaker baked extra," he said. Eliza swallowed hard. "I made a mistake today." Jacob leaned against the doorway. "So? Everyone does. But I wanted to prove that I belong here." Jacob's expression softened. "Eliza, do you think I've never made mistakes? Farming is hard work. I've lost crops to drought, hired the wrong men, even misjudged people I trusted. But I learned from each mistake, and I got better. That's what matters." Eliza looked up at him, her throat tight with emotion. "Don't let one bad day shake you," Jacob said. "Tomorrow's another chance to get it right." As he walked away, Eliza wiped her eyes and promised herself she would get it right. The next day, Tommy decided to prove himself. When Henry asked him to help mend a broken fence, Tommy worked harder than ever before. He carried heavy planks, hammered nails, and ignored the sweat dripping down his face. Roy watched from a distance, smirking. "Trying awful hard to impress us, boy." Tommy stood tall. "I'm just doing my job." Roy chuckled. "We'll see how long that lasts." That evening, as Tommy returned to the barn to put away his tools, he heard a rustling noise behind him. He turned and saw one of the younger colts had gotten loose from its stall. The horse was skittish, backing toward the open barn doors. Without thinking, Tommy acted. He moved slowly, holding out his hands. "Easy there, buddy," he whispered. The horse snorted and stomped its hooves, but Tommy didn't back away. He had seen Henry work with the horses, had watched how he spoke to them, how he moved around them. The colt hesitated, then, slowly, let Tommy approach. With steady hands, Tommy grabbed the rope around its neck and led it back inside. Henry and Roy entered the barn just in time to see it happen. Roy's smirk faded. Henry grinned. "Well, I'll be. That was some fine work, Tommy." Roy grumbled something under his breath and walked away. Tommy's chest swelled with pride. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. Meanwhile, at school, Sarah faced her own challenge. One of the other children, a boy named Billy, had teased her for wearing old clothes. "Bet your mama steals them from the garbage," he sneered. Sarah clenched her fists, but didn't say anything. Instead, she turned back to her book and focused on her studies. The next day, the teacher held a spelling competition. One by one, students were eliminated, until only Sarah and Billy remained. The final word was a hard one: perseverance. Billy got it wrong. Sarah got it right. As the class clapped for her, Billy scowled and looked away. Sarah smiled to herself. She had won, not just the competition, but the respect of her classmates. That night, as Jacob walked through his farm, he saw the Harpers in the yard. Eliza was teaching Sarah how to knead dough. Tommy was helping Henry clean the barn. Jacob watched them quietly, a feeling of pride swelling in his chest. Roy had been wrong. These people weren't a burden. They were becoming family. And as the stars twinkled above Willow Creek, Jacob Turner knew he had made the right choice.